One grudge, one act of retaliation, one deadly miscalculation. That's all it takes to transform petty revenge into unimaginable horror, proving that when hatred consumes the heart, even the smallest acts of spite can become instruments of the most terrifying deaths ever recorded. It was June 3rd, 2016, in a sprawling freight yard outside a small Kansas town where the summer heat had already begun settling into the rail steel by mid-morning. The facility stretched across 40 acres of switching tracks and loading platforms, where massive rail cars sat in long rows waiting to be repositioned for the next shipment. Merrick Boyd, a 38-year-old safety coordinator, had driven out early that Friday to conduct his weekly compliance inspection before the weekend audit. Boyd was methodical by nature, a trait developed during his years as an Army logistics specialist before transitioning to civilian railroad work. His job involved enforcing written safety procedures that many longtime workers viewed as unnecessary bureaucracy. He carried a clipboard and digital camera, documenting violations that could result in hefty federal fines. Most employees tolerated his presence, understanding the regulatory necessity, but a few saw him as an outsider, disrupting their established routines. 3 weeks earlier, Boyd had filed a formal report against Caleb Rourke, a 41-year-old veteran equipment operator who had been disabling safety interlocks to speed up switching operations. The violation cost Rourke his overtime privileges and damaged his informal leadership status among the crew. Text messages recovered later from Rourke's phone contained warnings for Boyd to stay clear of moving equipment, though investigators would determine these were sent after working hours when both men had left the facility. The morning inspection proceeded normally until Boyd reached the eastern section, where two freight cars sat positioned roughly 28 inches apart on parallel tracks. Security cameras captured him walking between the stationary cars, checking brake mechanisms and coupling hardware as required by his checklist. Boyd was foul of the track, positioned within a narrow temporary maintenance spacing used during switching operations, where all equipment movement was required to be locked out. The freight cars themselves were massive steel containers, each weighing over 80 tons when fully loaded with grain shipments destined for coastal ports. Their coupling systems required precise alignment, and the hydraulic brake mechanisms were designed to hold them stationary, even on slight inclines. Boyd had performed this same inspection routine dozens of times without incident, following protocols established after previous accidents at similar facilities across the Midwest. Minutes earlier, a shunting engine remained coupled to the cars and under remote control, with the air brake system fully charged and capable of movement on command. From a remote locomotive control console inside the operations building, Rourke deliberately initiated a brief forward movement command. The rail car lurched forward faster than Rourke had anticipated, closing the gap in under 3 seconds. Boyd was caught chest first between the steel surfaces. Multiple ribs were fractured immediately, puncturing both lungs as the pressure continued. His pelvis and upper thighs were crushed as the weight of the loaded car pressed against him. Blood began pooling beneath the rail before the emergency stop system finally engaged. The security footage would later show his final moments lasted less than 30 seconds from initial impact to complete stillness. Emergency responders arrived within minutes of the automated distress signal, but Boyd was pronounced dead at the scene. Control system logs showed the movement command had been activated during a designated exclusion period when personnel were known to be conducting inspections in that section. Phone records revealed deleted text messages that were later recovered through digital forensics. The investigation would reveal that Boyd had been planning to recommend additional safety measures following the upcoming audit. Rourke admitted to investigators that he believed a brief movement would intimidate Boyd without causing harm. Federal railroad safety officials concluded that the fatal compression would not have occurred without the deliberate activation during the restricted time frame. Rourke was charged with involuntary manslaughter with a retaliatory motive and cited by federal investigators for willful violations of railroad safety regulations tied to the unauthorized equipment movement. While investigators processed the Kansas freight yard, another conflict escalated in Arizona, where leasing employee Zelda Finch was about to discover that some warnings demand serious attention. It was August 12, 2015, in Phoenix, Arizona, where the late afternoon temperature had climbed to 109 degrees Fahrenheit after nearly a week of excessive heat warnings. At a mid-sized apartment complex on the city's west side, the multi-level parking garage sat mostly empty during peak afternoon hours. Its enclosed concrete design restricted airflow, allowing heat to build rapidly between thick structural walls. Zelda Finch, 27, lived at the complex and worked as a leasing support staff member for a different property across town. That afternoon, she remained at home longer than usual, organizing inspection documentation and reviewing maintenance photos. Shortly after 4 p.m., she gathered her belongings and headed to the garage to run errands before sunset. For months, Finch had been locked in a worsening personal dispute with another resident, Dana Lusk, 30, who lived in the same building. The conflict stemmed from repeated parking violations. Lusk frequently blocked Finch's assigned space, forcing her to wait or park on upper levels. After repeated confrontations failed, Finch began reporting the violations through the resident system. Citations followed, and Lusk's garage access privileges were eventually restricted. Other residents described the tension as obvious and ongoing. While management issued general parking reminders, the conflict remained a personal standoff rather than a workplace matter. Lusk, a long-term tenant, was familiar with the garage layout and gate systems after years of daily use, including the location of traffic sensors and access controls. Shortly after 4:15 p.m., Finch entered her vehicle and began driving toward the garage exit. As she approached the gate, Lusk interfered with the garage's vehicle detection system, wedging an object near the sensor that controlled the gate's movement. The obstruction caused the system to register a constant vehicle presence, keeping the barrier in a closed state. Surveillance footage later showed no other cars entering the garage during that window. An undetected wiring defect in the gate's control circuit prevented the system from clearing the fault once it was triggered, leaving the barrier unresponsive to normal reset commands. Finch stopped a few feet from the barrier and waited, assuming the delay was routine. After several moments, she pressed the gate call button and attempted to reverse, but the narrow lane and concrete barriers limited her maneuverability. Within minutes, the temperature inside her vehicle began rising sharply. The garage's concrete structure radiated stored heat, and the greenhouse effect caused the interior to warm faster than the surrounding air. Finch attempted to attract attention by honking and exiting her vehicle, but the garage remained empty. When the call system failed to respond, she returned to the car, conserving energy as the air grew heavy and stagnant. A resident returning from work nearly 20 minutes later noticed the stalled vehicle near the exit and forced the gate open manually after the sensor failed to respond. Finch was found unconscious behind the wheel after prolonged exposure to extreme heat. Emergency responders initiated resuscitation efforts, but she never regained consciousness. The medical examiner later determined that sustained hyperthermia following rapid incapacitation led to organ failure and death. An investigation into the gate malfunction revealed an underlying wiring defect and confirmed that the barrier had entered a faulted closed state after its vehicle detection sensor was deliberately obstructed. Surveillance footage and access timing placed Lusk in the garage shortly before the malfunction occurred. Confronted with the findings, Lusk admitted to interfering with the gate mechanism, stating he believed the disruption would be temporary and would resolve once another vehicle approached. Prosecutors argued that deliberately confining someone in a sealed structure during extreme heat demonstrated reckless disregard for human life, regardless of intent. Lusk was convicted of involuntary manslaughter and sentenced to 12 years in state prison. The case prompted changes to garage access controls across several residential complexes in the area, particularly during summer heat advisories. As detectives in Phoenix wrapped up their investigation into Dana Lusk, trouble was brewing in a completely different setting. Off the Oregon shoreline, fishing captain Orion Cade would soon learn that certain conflicts don't stay on dry land. It was November the 19th, 2017, along a commercial fishing pier on the Oregon coast, where early morning fog hung low over the water and wind gusts were already reaching 30 miles per hour. The weathered wooden structure extended 200 feet into the harbor, lined with mooring cleats and electrical hookups for the small charter boats that operated from the facility. Storm warnings had been issued for later that day, with conditions expected to deteriorate rapidly as a Pacific front moved inland. Orion Cade, a 42-year-old charter boat captain, had arrived arrived before dawn to prepare his vessel for what would likely be the last fishing trip before the weather turned dangerous. He operated on narrow profit margins, making every available day on the water crucial for his livelihood. Cade was known for his meticulous preparation and conservative approach to safety, traits that had kept him incident-free during 15 years of coastal fishing operations. Cade had recently ended a tumultuous 3-year relationship with Evan Pike, a dock worker in his mid-30s who also kept a small sailboat at the harbor. The breakup had been contentious, with disputes over shared property and accusations of infidelity. Pike had been ordered by the court to stay at least 100 yards away from Cade, following incidents of harassment and threatening phone calls. Pike had violated the restraining order multiple times, showing up at locations where Cade was known to dock and leaving hostile messages on his boat. Text messages recovered later from Pike's phone contained threats about making Cade regret the breakup and references to ensuring he understood the consequences of his actions. That morning, Cade was working alone on his 24-foot fishing boat, preparing nets and checking equipment while the vessel remained tied to the pier. The boat's engine was idling in preparation for departure, with the propeller intermittently engaged as wind and line tension affected the drivetrain. Security cameras mounted on nearby light poles captured Pike moving along the pier structure approximately 30 minutes before the incident occurred. Pike used a utility knife to cut through a secondary tension line that helped stabilize boats during high wind conditions. As the severed line released tension, the boat yawed sharply in the strengthening wind. The sudden lateral movement caused Cade to lose his footing on the wet deck. He stumbled toward the stern as the vessel lurched, unable to regain balance as the hull shifted beneath him. Cade fell overboard near the stern while the engine remained engaged at idle. His legs struck the rotating propeller as he entered the water, causing catastrophic lower limb trauma. Blood spread rapidly across the surface as he was forced briefly against the hull before slipping beneath the water. The boat continued to move erratically in the wind until the engine eventually stalled. Harbor Patrol responded to reports of an unmanned vessel drifting near the pier. Rescue divers recovered Cade's body 22 minutes after the initial emergency call, but he had already succumbed to blood loss and trauma from the propeller strike. The medical examiner determined that the combination of severe laceration and cold water exposure had caused rapid incapacitation. Investigators found the severed tension line and matched tool marks to equipment in Pike's possession. Security footage showed him in the area during the time frame when the sabotage occurred, clearly violating his restraining order. Pike initially denied involvement, but later admitted to cutting the line, claiming he only intended to inconvenience Cade. Phone records and witness statements contradicted Pike's claim. Harbor workers reported seeing Pike watching Cade's morning routine from a distance on previous days. Digital forensics revealed Pike had researched the pier's security camera blind spots in the weeks prior to the incident. Prosecutors argued that Pike's harassment and premeditated actions demonstrated reckless disregard for human life. Pike was charged with second-degree murder, but after plea negotiations, he was convicted of voluntary manslaughter. The court determined that while Pike may not have specifically intended to kill Cade, he had deliberately created a dangerous situation knowing Cade would be aboard the vessel. He was sentenced to 15 years in state prison, with eligibility for parole after serving 85% of his sentence. The case prompted new security measures at the harbor and stricter enforcement of restraining orders in maritime settings. We've got more disturbing revenge tragedies coming up, so hit that subscribe button if you want to see how betrayal and payback can turn brutally fatal in seconds. It was March 7th, 2018. In a 12-story office tower in downtown St. Louis, where late-evening maintenance work was being conducted during a scheduled power system test. The building's emergency lighting cast dim shadows through the corridors, and most tenants had left hours earlier. 2 emergency stairwells provided the primary evacuation routes, with Stairwell A typically remaining unlocked during maintenance operations, while Stairwell B was under a temporary security override. Selma Jory, a 51-year-old facilities supervisor, was conducting her final inspection of the day before the building's weekend closure. She was a veteran employee nearing retirement, known for her thorough approach to safety protocols and her dedication to maintaining building standards. Her colleagues described her as meticulous and professional. Mark Ellison, a 45-year-old maintenance contractor, had been working in the building for several years and was familiar with the emergency door systems. The magnetic door locks could be controlled remotely from the main security panel. 2 weeks earlier, Jory had hired Ellison for kitchen renovation work through his side handyman business. The results were substandard: crooked cabinets, faulty electrical work, and water damage. When Ellison refused refunds or repairs, Jory posted scathing reviews on Yelp, Google, and Facebook with photos of the shoddy work. Other customers came forward with similar complaints, and Ellison's side business collapsed overnight. Text messages from his phone showed growing anger, including threats to teach her a lesson. That evening, Jory was wearing a body-mounted safety camera, as required by building policy during solo inspections. An unrelated electrical fault within the building's ventilation control system had begun generating smoke that migrated upward through the stairwell shafts, though this was not immediately apparent. As Jory entered stairwell B to inspect the emergency lighting, Ellison activated the magnetic door override from the security panel. Because the building was undergoing a scheduled power system test, standard fire release interlocks for stairwell B were temporarily offline, leaving the magnetic lock engaged despite the smoke. He later admitted to investigators that he intended to trap her temporarily as payback for the online reviews, believing she would eventually be found when security made their rounds. The electrical fault suddenly worsened, filling stairwell B with thick smoke. Jory attempted to force the sealed door, but could not overcome the magnetic locking mechanism. The body camera recorded her increasingly desperate attempts to escape as smoke continued to accumulate. The concrete stairwell acted as a chimney, concentrating the smoke and reducing visibility to near zero. Jory lost her footing on the steps and fell down multiple concrete risers, striking her head and back against the hard surfaces. The body camera continued recording until the battery failed. Building security discovered the electrical fault during a routine sweep and initiated emergency ventilation procedures. Jory was found unconscious in stairwell B when responders forced the door open. She was pronounced dead at the scene from a combination of smoke inhalation and traumatic injuries sustained during the fall. Security system logs showed that the magnetic door lock had been activated from the main panel during the time frame when Jory was conducting her inspection. Ellison initially denied involvement, but later admitted to sealing the door, claiming he was unaware of the electrical fault and insisting he only meant to scare her. Investigators determined that while Ellison could not have anticipated the electrical malfunction, his deliberate action of confining Jory in the stairwell as retaliation for a personal grievance directly contributed to her death. Mark Ellison was charged with first-degree involuntary manslaughter. After a 3-week trial, he was found guilty and sentenced to 12 years in state prison. During sentencing, the judge noted that Ellison's vindictiveness over negative online reviews had cost Selma Jory her life and devastated her family. Ellison showed minimal remorse during the proceedings, maintaining that he never intended for anyone to get hurt. The Jory family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against both Ellison and the building management company that settled for an undisclosed sum before trial. The investigation into Mark Ellison had reached its final stages in St. Louis, but down in Florida, danger loomed at an apartment complex. Maintenance worker Harlan West would soon find out the fatal price of certain unauthorized alterations. It was July 22, 2016, at a residential complex in Tampa, Florida, where evening humidity hung thick and temperatures remained in the mid-80s despite the late hour. The facility featured a large community pool with a retractable fiberglass cover system. The pool had been partially drained for maintenance, exposing several feet of concrete walls above the waterline. Harlan West, a 34-year-old night maintenance worker, was completing his final rounds before scheduled repairs. He was known for his professionalism in ensuring recreational facilities remained safe and functional. Noah Briggs, a 29-year-old resident of the complex, had been involved in an escalating dispute with West over noise complaints. West lived in an adjacent unit and had filed multiple complaints with the Homeowners Association about late-night gatherings at Briggs's apartment that violated community quiet hours. These complaints had resulted in fines totaling over $1,500 for Briggs and a formal warning that further violations could result in lease termination. Text messages recovered later from Briggs's phone contained hostile references to West and statements about teaching him a lesson for ruining his life over nothing. Briggs had become increasingly agitated about the financial burden of the fines and what he perceived as West's excessive interference in his personal activities. The pool cover system consisted of motorized tracks and a large fiberglass panel that could be extended across the water surface. That evening, West was conducting his standard closing inspection of the pool area. A resident operating a recreational drone captured footage during West's inspection, recording him walking along the pool's edge, examining the cover mechanism. Briggs had accessed the pool equipment area earlier that day and loosened several critical anchor bolts beneath the fiberglass cover. These bolts were essential structural components that distributed the cover's weight across the support framework. Briggs later claimed he intended only to create a malfunction that would reflect poorly on West's maintenance work and potentially get him reprimanded by management. As West stepped onto the pool deck adjacent to the cover's track to complete his inspection, the compromised support system experienced progressive anchor bolt failure. The fiberglass panel, carrying a distributed load of several hundred pounds across its support framework, collapsed without warning. West fell 9 feet onto the exposed concrete bottom of the partially drained pool, striking the hard surface with significant force. The collapsing cover material fell on top of him, creating additional impact trauma. The drone footage captured the sudden structural failure and West's fall, though the angle prevented clear visibility of the final impact. Multiple fractures to his skull and spine occurred upon contact with the concrete surface, and movement ceased within seconds of the collapse. The resident operating the drone immediately contacted emergency services after witnessing the accident. Paramedics arrived within 8 minutes, but found West unresponsive beneath the collapsed cover material. He was pronounced dead at the scene from traumatic injuries, consistent with a high-impact fall onto concrete. Investigators examining the pool cover system discovered tool marks on the loosened anchor bolts that matched equipment found in Briggs's apartment. The drone footage provided clear evidence of the structural failure sequence, and engineering analysis confirmed that the cover would not have collapsed without the deliberate tampering. Text message records and witness statements about the ongoing dispute established Briggs's motive. Briggs initially denied involvement, but later admitted to loosening the bolts, claiming he intended only to create a mechanical failure that would embarrass West professionally. Structural engineers determined that loosening the anchor bolts caused uneven load redistribution, resulting in progressive shear failure across the remaining supports, making catastrophic collapse inevitable under normal operating conditions. Briggs was charged with manslaughter under Florida law. Following his conviction, he was sentenced to 12 years in state prison. The case prompted new inspection requirements for pool cover systems and stricter penalties for tampering with shared recreational facilities in residential complexes. Thanks for watching. Want to see more? Click on your screen now.